All right. Hello, my name is Tyler Dumbald. Here's my research presentation, The Confederados, a Forgotten Immigration Story. Picture of the Confederacy and a picture of Brazil. Some basic background information. Again, you could pull this up if you just looked up Confederados on Google. Following the U.S. Civil War, an estimated in 1865, an estimated 10,000 to it's 10,000 is the moderate, high is 20,000, low is 4,000 Confederate soldiers and their families would move to Brazil. Brazil at this point it's kind of growing into itself. It wants to become kind of a export economy dominating country, so they just want to grow. Again, there's multiple at its peak. There's multiple settlements by Confederates throughout Brazil. Some in the Amazon, some in Bahia, some in the center, some more in the south. The most famous ones would be in São Paulo, and those are the that is Americana and Santa Barbara de Oesteio. They're neighboring. They're right next to each other. So there's that. Here's my thesis. It is a little bit longer, but I think it is valuable. It hits a lot of things. The immigration of Confederates to Brazil following the end of the U.S. Civil War in 1865 is often oversimplified and categorized as a failure by U.S. media immediately and in the decades following 1865. Historians from the fields of Brazil and the Confederacy have generally treated the immigration of Confederates to Brazil as a minor, unnoteworthy detail in history. These assumptions are false as it ignores the economic, religious, and educational contributions or effects brought to Brazil by the Confederados. So they'd be called in Portuguese. These contributions include the introduction of new technology to turn previously undeveloped land into developable land, the expansion of Protestantism in Brazil through missionary actions to reach us to the lower class, and the Western values that would be introduced through American schools. First, they start to teach literacy of the Bible, and then it would expand to other topics. These include liberalism and religious tolerance for some of the main Western values that were taught. Um, it does also demonstrate a little bit of a transition to modernism that we will see in the early 1900s. But what I'm trying to mainly here is that ignoring the contributions actively participates in the post-Civil War newspapers anti-immigration sentiment that really focus on a few ex-Confederates who desire to own slaves and exaggerates the failures. They really just try to make it negative to discourage immigration to Brazil. The lack of acknowledgement by modern historians is representative of the contemporary historical community's failure until recently to analyze the Confederados as they were a small immigrant group that would eventually largely assimilate into Brazil through miscegenation with the fellow European immigrants that would come and other non-white Brazilians. They would do after a few generations. They would mix. What this does by ignoring it, though, is it ignores the fact that Confederados were heavily influenced to immigrate to Brazil by the Brazilian government because of the welcoming policies. And what this does, the welcoming policies and the Confederates, what happened is you get a symbolic relationship that where it offered the Confederates a new home and an opportunity to create a new society that kind of emulated a pre-Civil War South. And Brazil got the ability to grow as a nation economically and gain more immigrants from a desired part of the world. They were really pushing for white immigrants from Europe or America to come to whiten the country, is what they were pushing for. But what in modern times, this relationship has raised questions as how to interpret the memory of the Confederados, especially with their racially ambiguous beliefs. Um, but the debate, again, is raging mainly between Confederado descendants and people who argue that celebrating the Confederados it harms race relations in Brazil by romanticizing them pretty much. Overall, it's a complex story from its inception to the historical field and how they view it in modern society. Like the Confederados are just they're interesting, they're unique. It's something to be researched. So here are some of the reasons. Oh, sorry. Just to note on my thesis, Protestantism is not inherently good. What I'm trying to say is that it does lead, the Confederados do demonstrate some ability to impact the shifts that we will see within Protestantism in the future. And then the American values that are introduced are as a result of the demographic change, and that will be focused on in a moment. The reasons why Confederates decided to immigrate to Brazil, which you can understand is the South is just destroyed primarily. It's not a good situation. So in the primary source, the South Carolina special correspondent from the Herald, it's published by the New York Herald in June 11th, 1865. And what it does is it just describes the problems of South Carolina. 2 years after the Civil War, it's destroyed. The Freedmen Bureau is trying to keep people alive with food, and then there's a lot of unreconstructed men who just haven't been. They're considered traitors by the government who just despise the North, and what they've done regarding race relations in South Carolina. And so through reading this, I found two quotes that I thought were very interesting and kind of demonstrate the mentality of some of the Confederados. So I'm going to read them. We old planters must get other labor or sell out and leave this country. For these free Negroes will not do for raising the cotton. Another one is they go, referring to Brazil, they go to escape from the humiliation of conquered people under military despotism and Negro suffrage. So what you see with this is there's just a lot of anger towards the North for the way the South is at this point. It is a thing of the economy is destroyed because labor's been destroyed. So land's destroyed, but then you have the suffrage where in freedom where many former slaves would refuse to work. It was too expensive for the former slave owners to cover it and pay for it. And then further, the thing is, in many of the southern states, African Americans outnumbered whites. And so in the case of South Carolina, there's about 400,000 African Americans and 300,000 whites. And so you had this fear of racial change that was occurring there. And so it's not a good situation. These men are very angry. They don't like the way their lives have changed. And so they argue that some of the reason why people go to Brazil is they think it has a better opportunity than what currently exists for them in the South. So then from here, we see what we see is the reason why some of the Confederates want to leave. And what we're going to see now is the Brazilians' symbiotic welcoming immigration policy. What were some of the reasons Brazil wanted them, and why did the Confederates choose Brazil over another place? So what you have to understand is Brazil in the mid 1800s wanted to start getting immigrants, generally from Europe or just white people, pretty much, because they had huge, vast land that they wanted to be filled up. Especially elites, because again, they're like, okay, more workers, more economic value to export. So what we see is in historian William Clark Gregg's book, The Elusive Indians, the way that the Brazilian policymakers who would want to try to encourage immigration, they realized that colonies of immigrants would open roads, harness rivers, and increase agricultural production. Having a larger workforce allows them to produce more, to help develop the land. And so they're going to create multiple agencies, especially one in Baltimore will be a huge one, but there'll be there'll be different chapters throughout the South that are like, let's go to Brazil. And so they'll try to bring them to Brazil. And for the Southerners, the Confederates, Brazil's an attractive outfit because there's a lot of reasons. But one reason I found that was interesting was Eugene C. Harder, in his book, The Lost Colony of the Confederacy, will say that, again, because there's multiple colonies and settlements in Brazil for the Confederados, it offered a variety of climates, including warm to moderate weather similar to that of southern states from which they came. It had plenty of available sugarcane, corn growing land, and cheap labor. Labor is referring to slavery, but what I'm trying to say is Brazil, there's different spots that could represent home. So if you're from somewhere that was really swampy and hot, there might, you may want to go somewhere more into the Amazon or whatnot. If you wanted somewhere that was a little bit more temperate, you may want to go to Sao Paulo. It's just like there was different areas for different places. Further, Brazil wanted these immigrants, so they're trying to make Brazil a huge place where this is where you should come. And so one thing that we see is with that is Brazil in their legislation would create federal conditions. So sometimes they would just pay for the voyage completely. They'd offer discount prices on land that was made really cheap. And it wasn't like this land was bad. It was decent land, but it was undeveloped. So if you can develop here, you have financial support to build the government centers to form these settlements. It wasn't just, hey, here's the land, figure it out. It was, okay, we're going to help you build a government mill. We're going to help you build a church. We're going to help you build an education center. Like the Brazilian government was using their hands to help. And so one thing that I find very interesting with it is in one case, so the McMullen will be a famous like colonial head that will form a Confederado settlement in Brazil. I believe it is the Americana one. And one thing that happened is their voyage is terrible. It's delayed. It shipwrecks once or twice. People die. It's not a good scene. But you had Dom Pedro II come to them when they land in Rio de Janeiro to give them hope. Say, hey, it's okay. You're here. Welcome. So you see that it's a head down. You have Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil, pushing forward to you. You're seeing Brazil wants these people here. And the Confederados, this is a better opportunity than what they have back home. They have an economy that they could potentially go. they don't have to deal with the military deficit in that. It's just sometimes a better option. So a lot of people again would leave. And I'll hit on the note with slavery. Not every single Confederado owned slavery, but what that did offer to them was you can make something of yourself, society. And so it was just a better opportunity, is what a lot of we see. And so that continues. One thing what we see is, especially when I was doing my research, that I noticed was the American media is really negative, especially the primary sources about how to display Brazil and people that want to go there. Again, a lot of the newspapers come from the north at this point. The South's been destroyed. But one thing I found was in the article, the newspaper, Brazil, not the place, published again by the New York Herald on September 24th, 1865. It outlines how many Brazilians had thought, oh, let's go to Brazil because they have slavery. And then what they do is they get a writer from the Mobile Advisor, and that's in Alabama, who apparently lived in the South, and to build trust, that goes, slavery is not what you think it is over there. It is a thing of, you can't, there aren't as strict separation. You have many times where an Afro-Brazilian will be on equal standings with a white person. And that was different from what was in the South, the Confederacy. And so what we see is this media is, again, they're pushing this thing of, we need people to help rebuild the South. Because again, it's part of the Union. Somebody's got to help rebuild it. And so if you have a lot of people leaving, it's not good. So we have that. One thing that I find though too, after they've tried to build trust with having a Southern writer say Brazil is bad, is they get somebody to go in the final couple sentences, Brazil is not the place for him, referring to Southern. It will be better for him to remain where he is, accept the results of the Southern Confederacy's experiment, just as he finds them. Having eaten his cake, it is useless to cry over it. Like, they just tell him, like, get over it. Like, you lost the war, now help rebuild. So I thought that was very interesting. It's just interesting. Specifically, Harder will argue in his point. He will mention how Robert Lee, again, just he's very sympathetic to the South. He's a hero. I'm sorry for the way life is. Like, I don't want this to happen, but it's happening. But we should stay to rebuild the South and try to make it a better place. And so the U.S. media will take that and they'll be like, see, even your hero says Brazil is bad. Don't go. Like, stay here. Fix the South. And so I just thought it was an interesting note. Contributions to Brazilian society. Let me get that down here a little bit. So generally, the contributions have been kind of more minor, or it's like, okay, they helped with agriculture. That's generally what the modern view has been. But what you have to understand is the Confederados really kind of assimilated into Brazilian society. So a lot of their stuff became, well, it's just a Brazilian who created this, native born Brazilian society made this. But, they're a smaller immigrant, again, 10,000 is what the estimate is. And so by the third generation, they start to speak Portuguese. They start to assimilate. They start to marry outside of the settlements. They start marrying Brazilians and other immigrant groups. So we see the Confederados kind of become assimilated. And so building on this, the most commonly associated things that, the Confederates get contributed to them is the fact that they helped introduce steel tip plows, mold bar plows, rattlesnake watermelon, upland coffee. Now, these are all things that would come from the Confederados, but James M. Darcy and Cyphers B. Darcy, in their book, the Confederados, an Old South immigrant in Brazil, they're twins, but they're both historians, will argue is that yes, they brought these in, but realistically, Brazilian society was already kind of moving in a way that, with all the different immigrant groups, that they would have just got them naturally. And what he argues is that the biggest benefits that we see, not benefits, but biggest contributions that they bring to Brazil is we see Protestantism and Western style education grow from it. And what this is it grows as a result of they're Protestants themselves, the Confederados. And so the schools or the churches that were being built, by the government and all that, they're Roman Catholic. So that's not going to work. So they build their own schools. And part of this too is, as a Christian, you're supposed to missionize. And so we see the Confederates missionize, and they can't get really the elite to convert to Protestantism, as they're very heavily into the Catholic Church. But the working class isn't as much, because they're on they're on the lows, and so that they'll start to try to convert them over to it, try to bring them in. Again, they're teaching literacy to read the Bible, and that'll expand to Western schools. Again, these schools are based on Roman Catholic. So what happen is a lot of these American schools are using Americans or Confederados to teach them, and so they teach what values were in America at this point. Liberalism, religious tolerance. Religious tolerance is a little bit more simple because, again, they're the minority here and they want to be tolerated. But what I'm trying to argue here, especially with Protestantism, again, these branches are Baptist and Methodist and Pentecostal are the main ones. What I'm trying to say is we see that the Protestantism grows from the Confederados. They start to push it. They're not the first ones to introduce it, but their missionaries and their schools are one of the huge driving forces that will kind of create a Protestant branch that grows in Brazil. The modern day in the 2020 census, they say that 31% of Brazilians are Protestant. It's just we are seeing the impacts there, that their contributions, they're more neutral, is that it's Protestant is grown in Brazil. So there's that. They brought agriculture. They did do that, but again, the Dossi twins, what they argue in their book is Protestantism and American schools are huge things that were brought over. Further, to understand the Confederados, their legacy today it's interesting. It's really been pushed under a microscope as we see, especially what will be argued by Jordan P. Brasher. He's a geography professor and he's a expert in the field of Confederate memory. In his article, "The Crisis of the Confederate Memory in the Interior of Sao Paulo in Brazil," is following he claims it to be global. The 2017 white supremacist attacks in Charlottesville, Virginia, will have a global impact. And what he does is specifically focuses on Brazil. He does a case study in Santa Barbara de Oeste and Americana about how the Confederates' legacy is being challenged or viewed. And so what we see is this legacy is challenged. It's like they didn't do good, or there's sides that say they did good, and sides that say no, they're not worthy of remembering. And so what he found was that a lot of the Confederados and their descendants, they hold this annual celebration called the Festa Confederada, and it's like stepping back into the old South, antebellum South. You have the flag flying, you have Southern dance, Southern culture, English. They dress up in the old style military outfits. The flag is flying, they sell it. It's watermelon, fried chicken, grits, biscuits, gravy. It's all being sold there like it's a Southern heritage festival almost. And so what happens that Brash will argue is that the Charlottesville incident causes this big, it puts Confederate memory under this microscope. And what he noticed is that Confederados paint a very positive picture. They have a museum in Santa Barbara that they use to kind of emulate and teach teach Brazilians, okay, this is our society. And what it does is it really kind of doesn't talk about slavery. It really just like, oh wow, they contributed to agriculture, Protestantism. There's not mentions of the fact that they fought for slavery in America, and then they came down to Brazil, and some of them owned slaves. They don't mention it. And so what he has is then he points to the other side that again, Rises 2017 has only been increasing in numbers that say you're romanticizing the Confederados, and they fought for slavery. They brutalized Afro-Brazilians in Brazil and African Americans in the South. They're not worthy of being memorized. Like we must memorize the horror, not the oh wow, different culture. And so what we have here is they have two photos. We have a photo from them dancing in the Confederados, and then we also have a photo here that describes. Again, I don't speak Brazilian. I just use Google Translate, honestly. And what this says is, don't down with the Confederate flag. Don't fly hate. It's a thing of you have a group that says it's my history, and the other's pushing it's racist. Like it romanticizes slavery. It's not good. And so this memory has been really challenged in recent years. And I think it's interesting. It's going to help push Confederados in their impact on society into more into the field now. And I think that's a good thing to study them. Now my thoughts on the experience with research. I want to just say I love the project. I enjoyed it. I learned, but it was difficult. The main issue I found was there's not a lot in the recent historiography. A lot of it's from the 1980s and 90s is the most recent stuff. Again, there was waves. 1920s was the first wave, and the second wave was like the 50s to the 80s and 90s. I think that's it. It also made me really appreciative in the fact that if you study a country in an area, you need to speak the language. I don't speak Portuguese, so it made it really hard because there was a lot of stuff from Brazil that wasn't translated. I can't translate, so it made it difficult for me, these articles and books, to look at because I can't speak it. So it gave me a kind of a new perspective to be like, okay, that's important to have. So there's that. But overall, I really enjoyed this project. I thought it was fun. I learned more about how Brazil and America are connected to an extent. And I previously had known about it, and I thought it was just kind of a small thing, but I've learned a lot from it. Here are just the links to the images that were used throughout this source. So whether that was primary source, pie chart, different things like that. I just want to say again, thank you for spending your time to listen to this and watch it. Have a great day.